Did you know that in a world without modern medicine, without our understanding of the brain, people still wrestled with the very human questions of growing old? Did wisdom always come with age, or did old age sometimes bring something else entirely? Travel back to the medieval period, from the 5th century to the 15th century, and uncover how people saw the twilight years. Number 1. The practical wisdom of experience. Beyond grand philosophical ideas or deep theological insights, the medieval world deeply valued a different kind of wisdom that came with old age. The practical, hard-won knowledge gained from a lifetime of doing. This was the wisdom of experience forged through seasons of planting and harvesting, years of crafting and building, decades of managing a household or a domain. It was not found in ancient books or divine visions, but in the calloused hands of a master craftsman, the weathered face of a seasoned farmer, or the steady gaze of an elder who had seen many winters and many wars. In a society where knowledge was often passed down orally from one generation to the next, the elderly were living libraries. They remembered the specific quirks of the local climate, the best times to plant a particular crop, or the signs of an approaching harsh winter. A young farmer might consult his aged father or grandmother about a persistent blight on the crops, confident that their long years of observation would offer a solution. They knew which remedies worked for ailing livestock, having tried many over the years. And they understood the subtle art of coaxing a meager harvest from stubborn soil. Their advice was not based on abstract theory, but on repeated, observed success and failure. This accumulation of practical agricultural knowledge was vital for survival in a time before widespread printed manuals or scientific institutes. Craftsmen, too, relied heavily on this experiential wisdom. The journey from apprentice to journeyman to master was a long one, often spanning decades. A master carpenter, or weaver, aged and perhaps with slightly trembling hands, still possessed an unparalleled understanding of their materials and tools. They knew the grain of every wood, the tension of every thread. A young apprentice might watch an aging master patiently work on an intricate piece, learning not from formal lessons but from the sheer dexterity and judgment honed over a lifetime. The master knew the shortcuts, the subtle tricks, the feel of the material that only years of practice could teach. Guilds, which were associations of craftsmen, often held their oldest members in the highest regard, not just for their status, but for the deep well of knowledge they represented. Their long experience ensured the quality of the craft and the continuation of traditions. In the realm of governance and law, practical wisdom was equally crucial. Village elders, often the oldest and most respected members of the community, frequently played a significant role in resolving disputes. They remembered local customs, the exact boundaries of property lines, or how similar disagreements had been settled generations ago. Their long memory served as a living archive of community law and precedent, offering a stable reference point in times of conflict. A lord might consult his most ancient vassals or advisors, valuing their experience in dealing with rebellions, managing land, or negotiating peace treaties. These were not men who had merely read about warfare or governance. They had lived through it, bearing the scars of past struggles and the triumphs of past victories. Their counsel carried weight precisely because it was rooted in lived reality. Even within households, the practical wisdom of the elderly was paramount. An old woman, perhaps a grandmother, or the mistress of a large household, held immense authority and knowledge. She knew the most effective ways to preserve food, how to spin and weave, how to care for the sick using traditional remedies, and how to manage the complex daily routines of a medieval home. Her accumulated knowledge was essential for the smooth functioning of the family unit, and her judgment on domestic matters was often unquestioned. She might know how to prepare a particular herb for a child's fever, or how to stretch meager supplies through a long winter. Insights gained from decades of managing a household, possibly her own, and then her children's. Military leaders, too, often relied on the practical wisdom of veteran knights or commanders. A general, though young and perhaps fiery, would seek the counsel of an older, battle-hardened knight who had survived numerous skirmishes and campaigns. This elder might possess an intuitive understanding of terrain, troop movements, or the psychological impact of certain maneuvers, lessons learned not from strategy books, but from the brutal realities of the battlefield. His advice could mean the difference between victory and devastating defeat. The experience of surviving multiple battles, of seeing firsthand the ebb and flow of combat, imparted a wisdom that no theoretical training could replicate. These veterans understood the practicalities of logistics, the resilience of soldiers, and the subtle signs of morale, all learned through hard-won encounters. This valuing of practical experience-based wisdom meant that old age was often viewed as a repository of essential skills and knowledge. It was a time when the mind, even if physically slowing, had accumulated a vast storehouse of useful information and tested methods. The elderly were not just respected for their years, but for what those years had taught them, for the tangible skills and insights they could still offer to the community. Their knowledge was practical, applied, and vital for the daily functioning and survival of medieval society. Number 2. The spiritual journey of decline. In the medieval world, life was often seen as a temporary journey towards an eternal destination. Death was not an ending to be feared in isolation, but a transition, and old age was its direct, unavoidable prelude. This perspective transformed the physical and mental decline associated with senility into a profound spiritual journey, a period of intense preparation for the afterlife. The weakening body, the fading memory, the increasing frailty were not just burdens but signs. They were reminders of human mortality, prompting individuals to turn their thoughts towards God and the salvation of their souls. The concept of memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning "remember that you must die," was pervasive in medieval art, literature, and religious practice. Skulls, decaying bodies, and the figure of death were common motifs, appearing in frescoes, manuscripts, and church decorations. These were not meant to instill despair, but to serve as a constant reminder of the impermanence of earthly life and the inevitability of divine judgment. For the elderly, these reminders were especially potent. Every ache, every lost thought, every gray hair served as a personal memento mori, urging them to put their spiritual house in order. Old age became the final, crucial chapter in the preparation for eternity. Religious texts and sermons frequently emphasized the importance of a good death. This concept was so vital that specific handbooks, known as Ars Moriendi, the art of dying, were produced and circulated. These texts provided instructions on how to face death with faith and courage, how to resist the devil's temptations in the dying moments, and how to ensure one's soul was in a state of grace. Old age was implicitly, and often explicitly, presented as the ideal time to fully embrace these teachings. It was the period when worldly distractions should diminish, allowing for intense introspection, confession, and repentance. The physical decay of senility, therefore, could be reinterpreted as a stripping away of the temporal, leaving only the spiritual essence ready for its ultimate journey. Confession and receiving the last rites are profoundly significant rituals for the aged and infirm. As physical strength waned and the mind perhaps grew less sharp, ensuring a clear conscience and receiving absolution for sins became paramount, priests would visit the elderly sick, offering spiritual comfort and performing the sacraments that were believed to cleanse the soul and prepare it for entry into heaven. For many, old age meant an increased dedication to prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, often withdrawing from worldly affairs to focus almost entirely on their spiritual well-being. Monasteries and convents often had infirmaries where the elderly members of the community could spend their final years in quiet contemplation, surrounded by spiritual support. The famous Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, depicted death-leading individuals from all walks of life, kings, peasants, popes, children, in a macabre procession. While it emphasized that death spared no one, it also often placed the elderly closer to the front of the line, literally and figuratively. Their long lives meant they were closer to their appointed end. And this visual reinforced the idea that old age was the final stage before the dance concluded. The physical manifestations of senility were simply part of this universal process, signs that the individual was approaching their divine appointment. The gaunt, frail bodies of the aged, often depicted in religious art, were not just symbols of physical decline, but also of spiritual transcendence. A saint, in old age, emaciated and perhaps disoriented, was often portrayed as radiant with spiritual light, their earthly vessel decaying as their soul soared towards God. This perspective offered a framework for understanding and accepting the hardships of old age. Forgetfulness or physical weakness were not merely ailments but natural consequences of the body's diminishing capacity, a reminder that the true self, the immortal soul, was distinct and enduring. The challenges of senility could be viewed as a final test of faith, an opportunity to demonstrate humility and trust in God's plan. It was a time to let go of earthly attachments and to fix one's gaze firmly on the spiritual realm, preparing for the ultimate transition from the temporal to the eternal. The decline of the mind and body, therefore, became an integral and meaningful part of the spiritual journey itself, bringing the individual ever closer to their ultimate destiny in the presence of the divine. Number 3. The folly of old age. While many medieval perspectives celebrated wisdom in old age, there was also a distinct, often satirical view that old age could bring not wisdom, but foolishness, irrationality, and a profound loss of dignity. This counter-narrative challenged the automatic veneration of elders, painting a picture of senility as a period of diminished mental capacity, childlike behavior, or even heightened folly, leading to a loss of respect rather than its gain. It was a stark contrast to the image of the revered sage, highlighting the unpredictable and often undignified aspects of mental decline. Medieval literature, especially satirical works and popular tales, frequently portrayed elderly characters who were stubborn, foolish, or even comically misguided. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales offers several glimpses into this view. In the Rye's tale, the old miller, Simkin, is characterized by his boastfulness, dishonesty, and ultimate foolishness, despite his age. His senility is linked to his diminished judgment and his inability to recognize trickery. Even the wife of Bath, though a vibrant and complex character, humorously describes her elderly husbands as easily manipulated or even foolish, in their desires, suggesting that old age did not necessarily bring wisdom in matters of love or worldly affairs. These literary portrayals reflected a common understanding that the mind could indeed falter and become susceptible to errors in judgment as one aged. Morality plays, which aimed to teach moral lessons, sometimes depicted old age as a period particularly prone to sin rather than spiritual refinement. Characters representing old age might be shown giving in to gluttony, avarice, or even lust, behaviors that would be particularly grotesque or foolish when indulged by someone nearing the end of their life. This challenged the notion that spiritual wisdom naturally accompanied advanced years. Instead, it suggested that the weaknesses of human nature could persist or even intensify in old age, leading to a loss of self-control and dignity. The image of a lustful old man or a greedy old woman was a common trope, highlighting the moral failings that could accompany physical and mental decline. Artistic caricatures and popular fables also reinforced this view. Some illustrations depicted old people acting childishly, engaging in nonsensical activities, or displaying extreme emotions that were considered inappropriate for their age. These images served to mock or lament the loss of reason and self-control that could accompany senility. The dirty old man trope, while not explicitly medieval in the modern sense, has roots in medieval fables and songs where older characters, far from gaining wisdom, become consumed by base desires in a way that was seen as grotesque or pitiable. Their age, instead of curbing such impulses, seemed to make them more apparent and ridiculous. The limited medieval understanding of mental illness also played a role. While there was no modern concept of dementia, extreme behaviors exhibited by the elderly, such as profound confusion, irrational outbursts, or a complete loss of memory, were recognized as a departure from normal conduct. These behaviors were sometimes attributed to natural decay, but also occasionally to demonic influence or moral failing. Regardless of the explanation, they were seen as a mark of senility, and they often led to a loss of the respect that might otherwise have been accorded to old age. A once wise elder who began to speak nonsense or act irrationally would inevitably lose their standing in the community, their wisdom overshadowed by their perceived foolishness. Stories circulated about elderly lords or rulers who, in their dotage, made disastrous political or military decisions, leading to the ruin of their lands or families. Their long years had not brought insight, but rather a dangerous decline in judgment, making them easy targets for manipulation or simply incompetent. Such tales served as cautionary examples, reminding people that age alone did not guarantee wisdom, and that the mind, like the body, could suffer severe decline. The very concept of dotage implies a state of mental feebleness characteristic of old age, a departure from mature reason and a descent into childishness or foolishness. This view of old age was a stark reminder that the journey towards wisdom was fraught with peril, and that the twilight years could extinguish the light of reason as easily as they could refine it. Number 4. The respected elder. In the hierarchical and tradition-bound societies of the medieval period, old age often automatically conferred a significant degree of respect, authority, and status. Unlike some modern views that might associate old age with infirmity or irrelevance, the medieval world frequently regarded elders as invaluable repositories of tradition, law, and practical knowledge. They were the living memory of the community, often consulted for important decisions and revered for their accumulated experience. This reverence was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, from the smallest village to the grandest monastery. In feudal society, the long-lived lord or lady, the aged knight, or the venerable village elder commanded respect not just for their position, but for the sheer number of years they had endured and the amount of life they had witnessed. A lord who had reigned for decades had likely navigated numerous crises, forged alliances, and seen his family through generations. His longevity itself was a testament to his resilience and capacity to rule, and his counsel was sought on matters of land allegiance and justice. Similarly, a knight who had survived many battles and campaigns was revered for his experience, his strategic insights valued by younger, less seasoned warriors. These individuals were not just symbols of continuity, but active participants in shaping the present through the lens of the past. Guilds, which organized craftsmen and merchants, also placed immense value on age and experience. A master craftsman earned his title through years of rigorous training and practical application, often spending decades honing his skill. The oldest masters were considered the ultimate authorities in their respective crafts, their judgment on quality and technique unquestioned. Their presence in a workshop or at a guild meeting lent an aura of wisdom and tradition. They were the ones who taught the apprentices, preserved the secrets of the trade, and maintained the standards of excellence. Their long years ensured that the guild's collective knowledge and reputation were passed down intact. Family structures in the medieval period, whether patriarchal or matriarchal, often placed the oldest living member at the head of the household. The elderly patriarch or matriarch held significant authority over their extended family, making decisions about marriages, land inheritance, and the general welfare of the kin group. Their wisdom in managing resources, settling internal disputes, and guiding the family through difficult times was essential. Their long life was seen as a source of stability and continuity, providing a grounding force for younger generations. They were the keepers of family history and traditions, connecting the present to a long line of ancestors. The importance of oral traditions further cemented the elders' respected status. Before widespread literacy and printing, much of a community's history, lore, and practical knowledge was passed down by word of mouth. Elders were the primary storytellers, the keepers of ancient sagas, folk tales, and local histories. They remembered past events, floods, famines, triumphs, and tragedies that shaped the collective identity of the community. Listening to an elder recount a tale or a historical event was not just entertainment. It was a fundamental way of learning about the world and one's place within it. Their memories were the community's living archives, preserving the past for the future. In legal systems, particularly at the local level, older individuals frequently served as witnesses or even informal judges in communal disputes. Their long memory of past events, local customs, and individual characters made their testimony highly valued. They were believed to be more impartial and less swayed by immediate passions, having witnessed the long-term consequences of various actions. Their perceived impartiality and deep understanding of the community's history gave their judgments significant weight, often resolving conflicts without the need for formal external authority. This trust in the elders' memory and judgment because the profound respect given to the wisdom that years could bring. Artistic depictions often reinforced this image of the respected elder. Older rulers, religious figures, or wise counselors were frequently portrayed with an aura of dignity, serenity, and profound wisdom. Their faces, though perhaps lined with age, were often rendered with an expression of calm authority and deep contemplation, embodying the wisdom that came with a long and well-lived life. These images served to visually affirm the societal value placed on the aged, treating them not as burdens, but as pillars of knowledge, stability, and revered guidance within the medieval world. Number 5. The philosopher's decline. The medieval period was deeply influenced by classical philosophy, particularly the works of Greek thinkers like Aristotle and Roman authors such as Cicero. These philosophical traditions introduced the idea that the rational mind, while capable of immense refinement through study and experience, was also susceptible to decline in old age. Wisdom in this context was an intellectual pursuit, requiring sharp faculties of memory, logic, and judgment. Senility, then, was viewed as a degradation of these very faculties, a tragic weakening of the intellectual power that defined a philosopher or scholar. Aristotle's extensive writings on the soul and its faculties, particularly his theories on memory, perception, and intellect, formed a cornerstone of medieval scholastic thought. His ideas were studied, debated, and integrated into Christian theology. While Aristotle did not focus extensively on old age in itself, his descriptions of mental processes implied that any decline in these processes would diminish intellectual capacity. Medieval scholars, working with these frameworks, would naturally ponder how age affected the very tools of philosophical inquiry, the ability to reason, to retain knowledge, and to engage in complex debate. The aging of the body was seen as a natural process, and it was understood that this physical decay could affect the subtle operations of the mind. Cicero's De Senectute, on old age, was a significant classical text known and discussed by medieval scholars. In this work, Cicero largely offers an optimistic view of old age, arguing that it brings freedom from passion, increased wisdom, and continued capacity for intellectual pursuits. However, even Cicero acknowledges the potential for physical and mental difficulties, including the weakening of memory. Medieval thinkers, while appreciating Cicero's positive outlook, also grappled with the undeniable reality of mental decline observed in the elderly. They debated whether the mind could truly remain sharp and robust in old age, or if a natural, inevitable process of deterioration began. Scholastic philosophers, such as Thomas Aquinas, dedicated vast intellectual energy to understanding the nature of the intellect, the soul, and their relationship to the physical body. While they often emphasized the immateriality of the soul, they also recognized that its operations were in this life intimately connected with the body's faculties. The weakening of the physical instruments of the intellect, such as the brain and the senses, was seen as potentially impairing the mind's ability to grasp universals or engage in rigorous logical analysis. The very idea of an intellectual life was built upon the assumption of functioning cognitive abilities, and the prospect of these abilities faltering in old age was a matter of concern. The decline of a revered scholar's intellectual sharpness was matter of quiet lament or even public discussion. Once brilliant theologian or philosopher, whose arguments had shaped discourse for decades, might in their later years begin to struggle with memory, lose the thread of complex debates, or repeat themselves. This was seen as a tragic loss, not just for the individual, but for the intellectual community. The capacity for rigorous philosophical argument or subtle theological exposition was understood to require a keen mind. And the erosion of this sharpness was a stark manifestation of senility. It showed that even the greatest minds were subject to the same natural processes of decay as the physical body. Writings from the period, though not always directly medical, sometimes described how a once vibrant and incisive mind might become clouded or confused in its later years. These descriptions were not just about forgetfulness, but about a fundamental loss of intellectual coherence and judgment. Such accounts highlighted the vulnerability of the human intellect to the ravages of time. The ideal philosopher was one who maintained clarity of thought throughout their life, but the reality of senility often presented a different picture, a mind that, despite years of cultivation and learning, could ultimately succumb to the biological processes of aging, losing its ability to pursue wisdom or engage in its profound intellectual endeavors. This philosophical understanding of decline was a sober recognition that even the most elevated human faculty, reason, was not immune to the effects of old age. Number 6. The humoral imbalance. In the medieval medical imagination, senility and even aspects of wisdom were profoundly understood through the lens of humoral theory, a system inherited and adapted from ancient Greek and Roman medicine primarily through the influential writings of Galen. This theory posited that the human body was governed by 4 fundamental fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with specific qualities, hot, cold, wet, or dry, and corresponded to elements, seasons, and temperaments. Health was a state of perfect balance among these humors, while illness, both physical and mental, resulted from an imbalance. Old age, according to this system, was a predictable and unavoidable shift in the humoral balance, leading directly to the conditions we now associate with senility. Galen's extensive medical texts, meticulously translated and adapted by medieval physicians, formed the bedrock of medical practice for centuries. Figures like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was a standard textbook in European universities for hundreds of years, further elaborated on these theories. According to this framework, old age was characterized by a distinct humoral complexion. It was predominantly cold and dry. This was a natural progression from youth, which was hot and moist, and adulthood, which was warm and drier. As a person aged, their natural heat, which was believed to be the vital force animating the body and powering its functions, gradually diminished. This reduction in heat led to an increase in coldness and dryness throughout the body, including the brain. The dominance of black bile, melancholy, and phlegm in old age was a key aspect of this theory. Black bile, associated with the qualities of cold and dry, was believed to contribute to melancholy, a state of profound sadness, introspection, and sometimes irrationality. An excess of phlegm, which was cold and wet, could lead to sluggishness, forgetfulness, and a general cooling of the internal fires that maintained vitality and mental acuity. When the brain itself, the seat of memory and reason, became colder and drier due to these humoral shifts, it was thought to be less capable of retaining impressions or processing information effectively. This physical change was considered a direct cause of forgetfulness, confusion, and other cognitive impairments seen in the elderly. Examples of this thinking permeated medieval medical texts and common understanding. Descriptions of elderly people becoming prone to forgetfulness, becoming weak, or succumbing to fits of deep melancholy were directly attributed to an excess of black bile. The physical changes of old age, wrinkled skin, decreased vitality, a slower metabolism, were all seen as outward manifestations of this internal cooling and drying process. Medieval physicians would prescribe remedies for the elderly focused on warming and moistening the body, not just for comfort, but to counteract the humoral imbalance. Foods like warm, moist broths, specific herbs considered heating, and even certain activities were recommended to restore some semblance of humoral equilibrium and hopefully alleviate the symptoms of old age. The physician Arnold of Villanova, a prominent figure in the 13th and 14th centuries, discussed extensively the changes in the complexion of the brain with age. He, like others, believed that the brain's substance itself became drier and less pliable, affecting its ability to perform its functions. This drying was not seen as a pathological disease, but a natural, inevitable part of the aging process governed by the laws of humoral physiology. Therefore, senility was not a specific disease in the modern sense, but a collection of symptoms arising from the natural, predictable, and universal humoral shift that accompanied advanced age. This medical framework provided a comprehensive, albeit now outdated, explanation for why some people became doting or forgetful in their later years, linking their mental state directly to the perceived changes in their bodily fluids. Number 7. The divine gift of age. In the deeply religious landscape of the medieval period, wisdom was often viewed not merely as a product of human experience or intellectual endeavor, but as a divine gift, a blessing bestowed by God. For many, old age was seen as a special period when individuals, having lived long and often righteously, were granted a closer connection to the divine. This perspective imbued old age and the wisdom associated with it with profound spiritual significance, seeing it as a time for deeper contemplation, spiritual insight, and preparation for the afterlife under God's grace. Christian theology, with its roots in biblical teachings, frequently equated wisdom with spiritual understanding and a life lived in accordance with God's will. The Old Testament books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes often extolled the virtues of wisdom, linking it to the fear of the Lord and righteous living. A long life, especially one dedicated to piety, could be interpreted as a sign of God's favor, and the accumulated wisdom of such a life was seen as divinely inspired. This wasn't just about earthly knowledge. It was about insight into God's plan, moral discernment, and a clearer understanding of spiritual truths. Monastic life provided a clear illustration of this belief. Old abbots and abbesses who had spent decades in prayer study and leadership were revered not just for their administrative skills, but for their profound spiritual insight. The Rule of Saint Benedict, foundational text for Western monasticism, explicitly called for respect for elders, seeing their age as a mark of spiritual progress and accumulated wisdom. The longer a monk or nun had dedicated their life to God, the more their wisdom was believed to reflect divine understanding. Their counsel on spiritual matters moral dilemmas, and even monastic governance was considered invaluable, stemming from a life lived in devotion and contemplation. Illustrious scholars and mystics often exemplified this idea. The Venerable Bede, an 8th century English monk and scholar, was renowned for his vast knowledge of history, theology, and science. His extensive learning and profound insights were widely perceived as the product of a life entirely dedicated to God and continuous study, culminating in his wise counsel in old age. Similarly, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, and polymath, was celebrated for her prophetic visions, theological treatises, and medical knowledge. Despite her physical frailties in old age, her wisdom was seen as a direct outpouring of divine inspiration, her advanced years providing a conduit for heavenly knowledge rather than diminishing her capacity. Artistic depictions frequently reinforced this spiritual veneration of age. Wise old saints, biblical patriarchs like Abraham or Noah, and venerated figures of the church were often portrayed with long beards and serene expressions symbolizing their profound spiritual wisdom and their closeness to God. These images were meant to inspire awe and reverence, showing that a long life, especially one lived in holiness, culminated in a divine connection. The white hair and wrinkles were not signs of decay but marks of distinction, earned through years of spiritual discipline and devotion. The respect given to elderly bishops, cardinals, or popes was another manifestation of this belief. Their long tenures in ecclesiastical office were often interpreted as a clear sign of God's enduring favor and the accumulation of profound spiritual wisdom. Their long experience in guiding the Church through various challenges lent their pronouncements and leadership an undeniable authority rooted in divine mandate. Their age was seen as a testament to their spiritual maturity, making them ideal arbiters of faith and morality. Furthermore, the practice of seeking counsel from ancient hermits or recluses, individuals who had withdrawn from the world to live lives of extreme piety and asceticism, underscored this view. These solitary figures, often living to great old age in remote wildernesses, were believed to possess a special, divinely granted spiritual knowledge. Pilgrims and seekers would journey to their remote dwellings, hoping to receive guidance on spiritual matters or to witness a miracle, trusting that the hermit's long life of devotion had brought them closer to God's truth. Their wisdom was seen as transcending ordinary human understanding, a direct consequence of their prolonged and intense communion with the divine, a gift of age.